On the 29th of July 2022, G2 announced that they would be signing HooXi as their IGL on a permanent basis. The signing will spark controversy, as many anticipated Alex, formerly of Vitality and more recently Fnatic, to be the headline signing for G2. Today I'm going to be exploring why G2 made this move, the potential of the new roster, and answering the question, is HooXi the right choice for G2? Alexi B first joined G2 in January of 2022, finalizing the G2 roster for the upcoming season. The move was met with positive reception, and even Carlos, the owner of G2, had expressed high expectations of the roster and his overall ambitions within Counter-Strike. G2's first tournament with their new roster was Blast Premier Spring Groups 2022, where G2 had a solid showing, placing 4th to 6th and qualifying for the Blast Spring Finals scheduled to take place in June. G2 even ramped up for IEM Katowice 2022, where they managed to place 2nd, losing out to a FaZe in hot form with JKS standing in. And despite a disappointing ESL Pro League Season 15, where Alexi B was replaced for Amanek for the first 3 games of the tournament, expectations were at all-time highs for the G2 lineup, and for the most part, they were delivering. G2 breezed through the European RMR to qualify for the PGL Major Antwerp. At the Major itself, G2 were dominant in the Challenger stage, and qualified for the Legend stage with the highest seeding. However, this would prove to be the beginning of the downfall for G2's 2022 lineup. In the Legend stage of the PGL Antwerp Major, G2 lost multiple overtime games and were eventually eliminated in the group stage by Furia. During this stage, Alexi B had a rating of 0.86 and G2 were labelled as chokers by the community. G2's next tournaments were underwhelming, with the top 4 finish at Blast Premier Spring Finals being the only notable finish. G2 would also fail to make top 8 at IEM Cologne, with losses against an underdog Movistar Riders lineup and a newly formed NIP roster. G2 were done. Out of 8 big tournaments, G2 had only made top 4 at 2 and failed to win a single trophy during their 2022 lineup stint. So what went wrong? Looking at the T sides for G2 basically answers all our questions. Versus top 20 opponents, G2 sit below a 50% T round win percentage. When compared to teams like Na'Vi, who have percentages above 50% for at least 3 maps, it seems pretty bad, but unfortunately, it gets a lot worse. When comparing T sides versus top 5 opponents, G2 are astronomically worse than Na'Vi, FaZe, and Cloud9, just to name some of the top teams. In fact, G2's T side roles were questionable from the start. A tweet from G2 coach Xtaz reveals some of the issues, such as Hunter being underutilized. In the beginning of the roster, Xtaz gave a lot of control over to Alexi B in terms of structure. However, the G2 coach would later emphasize the need to shift more control his way. Alexi B is not a bad IGL by any means, but he's a bad IGL for G2. Alexi B's style is definitely more structured, which was never the best fit for a team with Nico and Monizzi on the roster. So the question is, what can HooXi do? HooXi is well known for being the captain and IGL of the recently successful Copenhagen Flames roster. HooXi had almost exclusively been stuck within the Tier 2 circuit of European Counter-Strike. That is until they made a surprisingly successful run at the PGL Stockholm Major in 2021. Copenhagen Flames surprised everyone at the European RMR to qualify for the Major. Whilst the result was impressive, people were certain that the Danish roster would be eliminated during the Challenger stage. However, to everyone's surprise, Copenhagen Flames managed to top the Challenger stage to proceed to the Legend stage of the Major. At the Legend stage, the roster had a solid showing and narrowly missed out on playoffs, losing in overtime on map 3 against NIP. The run was labelled as a miracle run and a one-off, which was a fair assessment of what we had seen of the Flames so far. However, Copenhagen Flames once again would perform at the next Major, PGL Antwerp 2022. At PGL Antwerp, Copenhagen Flames had already qualified to the Legend stage, thanks to their performance at the European RMR. During the Legend stage, the roster managed to scrape through above the likes of G2, Vitality, Cloud9, and Liquid to secure a spot in the playoffs. What can we really conclude from this? HooXi may have had debatably more success recently as an IGL, but is he really an upgrade from Alexi B? Well, it kind of depends. HooXi has a style of calling that is a lot looser, and this may be advantageous to G2 with the mix of players that they have. In fact, I would argue that HooXi's calling style is a great fit for G2. However, HooXi is arguably a worse player than Alexi B overall. He has a rating of 0.82 at Majors. This is considerably worse than most of the poorest fragging IGLs in history. Think Karrigan, Zeus, or even Pronax. All of these players are statistically better rated than HooXi at Majors. Despite his success with Copenhagen Flames, HooXi is actually still quite unproven when compared to the likes of Alex or even Boomage, who were on the table for G2. But before we write off the idea of HooXi being the IGL of G2, let's consider another factor: the roles. In my last video, I already discussed JKS being introduced to the roster, however something I missed out on explaining were the T-side roles. So I'm going to do this here since now we know the current G2 roster. The most important thing to focus on here is the T-side roles, since this has been the issue for G2 since the beginning. With the current roster for G2, the roles actually make a lot of sense. HooXi would essentially be a hard entry with NiKo following up. JKS is proven to work exceptionally well in lurk roles, which is a position Hunter has proven to be underutilized in. And Hunter can now be a third man in, trade/support player for the roster, a position where he should thrive and reach greater potential. With your fifth player being a talented up-and-coming AWPer in Monderzy, G2 are actually looking like a well-rounded roster. If we consider these roles as being final, we could actually have a reason to be excited about this roster. HooXi doesn't have to be getting great ratings. In fact, he should be the statistically worst player on this roster by far. What we should really be concerned about is his ability to call and utilize the players on G2. There are other factors in this, however. We still don't know how the personality dynamic will work within G2 with this new roster. HooXi is basically going to be expected to bring a level of maturity, good mindset and hype to the team. Is this something he will be able to do? I'm not really sure, and to be honest, that's the main issue here. HooXi is not necessarily the upgrade we wanted in place of Alexi B, in fact he is arguably more of a side grade. The difference here is the following. The roles make a lot more sense for G2 now, the roster overall is an improvement, but the issue is that HooXi doesn't necessarily bring an extra level to G2. He brings improvements in some areas, but is actually a downgrade from Alexi B in others. Time will tell with this lineup, and while I do have hope for the roster as a whole, I wouldn't be surprised if HooXi doesn't turn out to be the greatest fit. The move overall is underwhelming, but I hope that HooXi can exceed our expectations.